We've come to our last chapter in the book we're going through, Classic Christian Thinkers with Canned Samples. And that thinker is C.S. Lewis. So welcome to our episode today. C.S. Lewis is just an absolute brilliant thinker when it comes to Christianity and just literary masterpieces. And, you know, I often list the books on the side here about what thinker people have written, thinkers have written. I'm not even going to do that. You're probably familiar already with C.S. Lewis. He's probably the most well known for his books like the Chronicles of Narnia and those kind of things. But he has a lot of books out there: Mere Christianity, The Problem of Pain, A Grief Observed, The Abolition of Man, Miracles. There are just a lot of books that he has written. And the great things about C.S. Lewis's books is not only are they well written, they're entertaining, they're interesting, they're very, very philosophically meaty. Even though he wasn't really a philosopher per se, he was more of a literary critic and guy in that genre. But he did write a lot on philosophical topics. But he writes in such a way that you don't have to be a specialist to be able to understand what he's saying. You can be, younger people, kids, students can read C.S. Lewis, his books, whether they're the other younger books like the Magician's Nephew, which I listened to some in the car when my family was driving. Never read that one. But then you got the more meaty ones too, like, Mere Christianity and those, and actually was assigned one for a class in graduate school, namely The Problem of Pain, which is his more philosophical look at the problem of pain and the problem of evil. And the other one on the opposite side of that is A Grief Observed, which discusses his wife's death and looks at the problem of pain and suffering from more of an emotional point of view. The book, The Problem of Pain, is more of an intellectual examination of the problem of evil. But he has several different contributions, and I'm only going to touch on the highlights of C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis was a 20th century literary master who a Catholic who taught in Europe and England, and has just given us a lot to think about, a lot of great books to read, and he's given us a lot of contributions too. And one of them, and a lot of these come from Mere Christianity, and if you haven't read Mere Christianity, then I would highly recommend that to you. It's a great book, and it does have a lot of not just interesting but thought-provoking ideas and arguments for God's existence, for example. Lewis is really good at making you think. And so some of the things that he gave us, some of his contributions would include the what's now become known as the trilemma, which he says either you think Jesus is Lord, or he's a liar or a lunatic. We have to avoid this nonsense, Lewis says, of saying that he was a great moral teacher. And when you think about it, that makes a lot of sense, because Jesus said things that, if he was just a great moral teacher, he probably wouldn't have said. He says that this would, he kind of thinking about the things that Jesus said would be more like somebody saying he was a poached egg and something like that. So he either was really the Lord, or he was a liar or a lunatic. The problem with the last two is that he demonstrated that he's Lord. He didn't just say he was Lord. He demonstrated it through his sinless life, his fulfillment of prophecy, his miracles, and ultimately his resurrection, which a lunatic and a liar wouldn't be able to do. He also is well known for various arguments for God's existence, such as the argument from desire. He says that if we have certain desires, there's got to be some kind of an actual fulfillment for those desires. So we have a desire for X, Y, and Z, in this case, God. There's got to be some kind of real fulfillment for that desire. And since all men have this desire, he argues, across time and across the world, for this what now has kind of become known as this God-shaped vacuum or hole in our heart and our being, there must be this God to fulfill that desire. We wouldn't have this desire if there wasn't something to satisfy it. He argues for reason. He argues, and how can we have consciousness? How can we explain the intellect just from a materialist point of view without God? That doesn't really make a lot of sense, he says. Argument for morality. He says that every law has a lawgiver. This is a famous argument that a lot of apologists use now. Every law has a lawgiver. There is a moral law, therefore there is a moral lawgiver. And this kind of argument has been used by well-known apologists like Norman Geisler, William and Craig, and many others. This is a very, very famous argument for God, for morality. And he said, well, there's got to be, there's this moral law, and this is almost, you're almost unable to deny it, because if you deny there's a moral law, then you're just left with anarchy. In fact, I would learn this stuff in school as a freshman grad student, my first semester. And so I would go try out this stuff. And there was a website called, I think it was called christiandebates.com, something like that. And I would just go try this stuff out to see if it really worked, right? So what do people say about this kind of stuff? Well, I was kind of threw this statement out there about, well, if you don't believe in absolute morality or objective morality, then you're left with all kind of problems. And this atheist came back with me and said, yeah, there's no such thing as objective morality. Well, I said, well, if that's the case, then there's really nothing ultimately and objectively wrong with raping a 13-year-old girl and murdering her. And his response, I thought I had him cornered, as apologists, we got him now. He came back and he said, you're right. There's nothing wrong with that. That's just what society tells us. That's a frightening person. That's the kind of person Aristotle said to be afraid of. Be kind of, not that the person lived that way. He probably didn't really live that way or really believe that. And if he really, I don't know. But that's the kind of thought process that's scary. But that's consistency when it comes to atheism and lack of morality. Not that all atheists deny morality. There are many atheists who want to argue for an objective morality. But that was Lewis's argument. Now, I have this pet peeve personally of taking this. I think it's a fine argument for morality, but I think there's a mistake that Christians make in saying there is a moral law, therefore there's a moral lawgiver, because every law has a lawgiver, and then making God equivalent to the moral law. And I think the argument, as Lewis states it, is correct, that every law has a lawgiver. There is a moral law, therefore there's a moral lawgiver. I think that is correct. But Christians oftentimes, and apologists especially, want to say God is that moral law. Well, I've already made one video on this. I'm probably going to make my next one on this too, just to come at it from a different point of view. I don't think it makes a lot of sense to say God is the moral law, or that God is our standard, or that the moral law that we're supposed to keep just is God. God is a unchanging in the classical sense. This is classical theology, right? So in the classical sense, he's unchangeable, immutable, impassible, eternal, simple, necessary, immaterial, infinite, all that. And humans are pretty much the opposite of most of that. We're contingent, we're changing, we're temporal, we are passible, we're material and finite and all this. So this doesn't make a lot of sense to me to say that our goal is to be like God, in the sense that he's somehow the moral standard, because as an infinite being who's not a human, he's an infinite non-human. And so we are supposed to live up to the human nature, not live up to the divine nature. All right. So ultimately, Jesus would be our exemplar, our goal as a human being. But I would say the divine nature is not. I would argue the divine nature is actually not a moral being, because to be a moral being means you're under some kind of a moral law, and God's not under any kind of moral law. So that would be more. I think that the way that Lewis makes the argument is good, as long as we keep it, that there is a moral lawgiver, and God is a moral lawgiver, and he has given us the moral law through our human nature, because I'm a natural law guy, and ultimately, really, Lewis was too. Lewis was a natural law thinker. He thought that you cannot separate the moral law from the human nature, because there is an objective human nature, and it's not simply that God issues divine commands. It's that he actually issues commands in accordance with the human nature, not in accordance with his nature, because God can't even make these sins. You think about it. God can't do things. God can't sin the way that we can. So we're not upholding, he's not issuing commands in accordance with his nature. He's issuing commands in accordance with our nature. It's wrong for us to murder. Well, God can't murder. He owns all life. He can't steal. He owns everything. but we can. God can't commit sexual sins. He's not a physical being. He doesn't lust, but we can. So his commands are in accordance with what it means to be a human being. He also argued that as Lewis argued for mere Christianity, and that he wanted to say there is this core Christianity that we all should be able to agree on: the Trinity, the oneness of God, the incarnation, all these different things. So he argues for this mere Christianity, hence the name of that book. And there's a lot of great things we can praise C.S. Lewis for. He's really showed that he can be an intellectual Christian. He has brought a lot of interesting argumentation and thought-provoking material to a wide audience. And of course, you probably know that he has, maybe you don't, a very interesting relationship with J.R.R. Tolkien, who of course is the Lord of the Rings author. And there's a lot of great things coming out both from Lewis and Tolkien. Lewis don't agree with everything he says. He did not hold to the inerrancy of Scripture, for example. He has a lot of great things to say. So read C.S. Lewis, read Sample's book. Again, I will leave a link to Sample's book in the description, but go out and read. I will also leave a link to Mere Christianity as well. That's a good one to start with. So read Lewis. He's really great. He's a great thinker. Be familiar with Lewis. Had a lot of wonderful things to say. And this concludes our series on classic Christian thinkers, an introduction by Ken Samples. Hope you have enjoyed the series. If you haven't watched the other ones, go back and watch those in a playlist. And like, subscribe, share, and leave a comment. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them. I appreciate you watching, and we'll see you next time.